Welcome back, deep divers. Ready to dive into inclusive education? This stack of resources you've given us looks fascinating. UNESCO guides, research papers, even a classroom toolkit. Looks like someone's serious about making education work for everyone.
Absolutely. And it's more than just a hot topic right now. It's about really changing how we think about education at its core.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. I get the feeling you're past the whole why is this important stage. You've clearly been thinking about this. So let's get right to it. Those practical insights and maybe even a few aha moments along the way about making education truly inclusive.
Sounds like a plan. We'll cut through the jargon and zero in on what you really need to know.
And I can already tell we're not just talking about local solutions here either. This UNESCO resource is used in over 80 countries. That's amazing.
It really highlights how universal this need is, doesn't it?
Hmm.
The fascinating thing is, while the main ideas behind inclusion are globally relevant, every learner's situation is unique, which is why we'll be using examples from around the world to give you that broader perspective.
I love that global lens. Okay, before we get lost in the weeds with specific strategies, can we talk about the elephant in the room for a second? That often misunderstood concept, the medical model of disability. We tend to get so focused on what a child's diagnosis is that we forget about the environment they're in.
Exactly. The social model of disability reminds us that it's not just about a student's inherent differences, but how our environments, both physical and social, can actually create barriers. Think about it. A building doesn't inherently disable someone who uses a wheelchair, right? It's the lack of ramps or accessible entrances that does.
That's such a powerful point. And it makes you think about all those seemingly small things in a classroom that can make a world of difference. I'm curious, what are some barriers you've come across in your work, and how can our listeners start to think about identifying those in their own context?
That's a great question, and one we'll dig into more as we go. But something that comes to mind immediately is,
It's easy to think, oh, special schools, that's the solution for students who need more support.
it's a common assumption, but like most things, it's not that simple. Special schools definitely have their place, but they shouldn't automatically be the go-to solution. Actually, this UNESCO guide brings up a really interesting point. It talks about how inclusive practices are changing education systems all over the world. There's this fascinating example from India.
Oh, before you share that, it makes me think of something you hear a lot, that inclusive education means so much extra work for teachers. But isn't that another myth we need to debunk based on what I'm seeing in these materials?
100%. A lot of what makes education inclusive is just good teaching, full stop. Take differentiated instruction, for instance. It just means recognizing that kids learn at different speeds and in different ways. And that helps all learners, not just the ones labeled as having disabilities.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's more about adapting your teaching style to meet everyone's needs, not looking at accommodations as extra work on top of everything else.
Exactly. And that actually ties into another super important piece of the puzzle we often forget about, the power of language.
Oh, yes. I was really struck by the part in the guide about identifying hearing impairments. It talked about these subtle clues teachers can pick up on, like a child always asking others to repeat what they said, or maybe always wanting to sit right at the front.
Those observations can be so crucial, right? And it goes way beyond identifying specific impairments. It's about being intentional with your language, making it mindful, respectful, and welcoming to every learner.
Could you say a little more about that? I keep thinking back to the social model we were discussing. How does language play into that? It's like our words can either make those barriers even higher or help tear them down, right?
That's such a good way to put it. Like, using person-first language can make a huge difference. Instead of saying autistic child, you say child with autism. It seems like a small thing, but it really shifts the focus to the person first.
Seeing the child, not the label. I like that. Okay. This has been really eye-opening so far, but I know our listeners are probably thinking, okay, but what can I do with all this? What are the actual strategies, the nuts and bolts of making education more inclusive?
Well, the UNESCO guide actually lays out a really practical framework that I find super helpful. It starts with figuring out what the barriers are, both in the learning environment itself and for each student as an individual.
And that goes way beyond just physical barriers.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about everything from how the curriculum is designed and how you teach it, to how you assess learning, even just the overall vibe in the classroom. The guide encourages you to ask, what's preventing the student from really participating and thriving? And once you've zeroed in on those barriers, you can start coming up with ways to get rid of them.
So it's about turning those aha moments into action. Speaking of which, I love that the guide has those 9 golden rules of inclusion. Talk about practical advice. Do any of those stand out to you?
They're all great, honestly. But if I had to pick, I love the emphasis on collaborative learning. The guide talks about pairing up students with different learning styles and abilities so they can learn from each other. That not only helps the students who might need a little extra support, but makes it a richer experience for everyone involved.
I love that, recognizing everyone's strengths. That reminds me of the story about Eunice and John from one of these research papers. They had really different needs, but they were both thriving in the same classroom.
See, that's what inclusive education is all about. It's not about trying to squeeze every student into the same box. It's about making a system where everybody has a real shot at success.
It's about recognizing that one size does not fit all. But let's zoom out for a second because inclusion isn't just about what goes on inside a classroom, is it?
Nope. It takes a village, right?
Yeah.
Like when schools team up with local businesses for job training or connect with community groups for after-school activities, that's what makes learning relevant and engaging for everyone.
It's about connecting school to the real world. And it really highlights that teachers aren't in this alone. That quote from the HSCL worker really stuck with me. They were saying how their role is so multifaceted. They're there to support students, families, and teachers too.
It's a true team effort, that's for sure. And, that brings us to something interesting to think about. If inclusive education is about creating a system that truly works for all learners, shouldn't that be the goal of all education, period?
Wow, that's a powerful question to consider. It's about so much more than just checking boxes and labels. It's about creating a learning experience that's truly equitable and empowering for every single student. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into inclusive education. We hope you're coming away with some practical takeaways, fresh perspectives, and maybe even a renewed sense of purpose as we all work towards a more inclusive world, one classroom at a time.